So without any further ado, I'll introduce tonight's speaker. So we're very pleased tonight to welcome Dr. Ryan Haecker. Ryan is actually a member of our group, so you may have seen him before his faces when he comes to talks here. Ryan, by background, has an undergraduate degree in history, master's degree in philosophy, and he just recently completed his doctorate with Rowan Williams at Cambridge in theology. So, he's got many research interests in a sort of wide variety of topics we could have sort of gone with tonight, because he offered me many options. But one of the main areas of academic interest to him is this intersection between philosophy and theology, sort of combining these two interests. Particularly looking at the ways in which philosophy through the ages has shaped the theological project, right? So going all the way back from the ancient Greeks through to the scholastic period, and then into the modern period, where in the whole scope of philosophy are there tools that can be used and applied for the study of theology. That's one of his sort of major areas of interest. His doctorate, I think, was actually in an area very closely aligned to this, speaking about particularly how logic is used in the theological project. Because you see, logic, science, the study, the art of reasoning, from Christian antiquity, really, was seen to be very, very important for the study of theology. But then as things developed through the course of the centuries, logic diversified, I think it's fair to say, in some ways, and the scope got rather narrowed in some ways. And so such that logic became, it developed particularly with the advent of the sort of early modern period development of mathematics and the scientific method. It became more narrow, it became more of a mathematical, more of a practical thing. And gradually this sense that logic could be something that could inform theology sort of gradually got split away. So I think Ryan is going to try to help to sort of heal that divide a little bit, show what it was from Christian antiquity that they recognized logic as being able to do. And so it's also sort of very relevant for us too. You know, St. Anselm said in the High Middle Ages that faith seeks understanding. And so it's very important, you know, because God gave us this capacity for reason to use it in order to get to know Him and to love Him better. That's really the whole aim of the theological project. So without any further ado, Ryan's now going to sort of explain all of this to us and show how logic helps to serve theology and to secure theology's position as queen of the sciences. So Ryan, thank you for being here, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you for that marvelous introduction. It's a pleasure and honor to be here to speak with all of you today. These are the words of Jesus Christ in the Gospel of John. He said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." We should not be afraid of the truth, we should seek it out. The truth will be the engine of our understanding, but equally the way that we emancipate ourselves from the bondage of sin and find our way to the love of God. Today I'm speaking to you about the use of logic for theology, what it means for theology, how we can come to understand God better by reflecting upon the way in which we think about our own thoughts and the way we reason. I'll be going through 3 different sections. The first is a theological interpretation of logic, or theology of logic. The second will be an exploration of the forms of logical reasoning. And third will be the way in which logic ought to be used to come to understand God and know God in theology. So, theology of logic. Today, a great question that often besets young people especially, but also skeptics and atheists is, what do we know, how do we know it, and from whom can we know it? And if you often watch the television, you might find that when great questions today are raised, whether they be moral or whether they be cosmological, it's not often Christians or theologians who are asked to speak about the subject. They don't often interview the cardinals and bishops about issues in morality or in cosmology and so on. Rather, we find that maybe physicists, technologists, business people are often the people who are called upon to answer those questions. But if you think about it, in ancient times, up to the present day, people often looked for people who they considered wise, people who knew about the wisdom of the ages, people who knew about their ancestors, people who knew about the ancestral deities or spirits and the powers of the gods that shaped the world, to give them answers to how they ought to live and how they understand their lives. So in a certain sense, the priests, the pontiff, the pope, and the bishops that are communing with the pope through the church have a special capacity to speak to us from the past about the meaning of God's revelation to us. We find, however, that we have a rupture today in our sources of authority. We look to the authorities of the world, people who have understanding of the natural cause of the world or of its business powers and operations, rather than to these ancestral spirits. So what I want to ask of you today is, how can we come to know what is true and what is the reason by which we know it? So oftentimes, in answering this question, we would give the answer of science. We would say that science provides us with a way of knowing the truth of the world. And we often assume that science is specifically natural science, that is a way of understanding the world by experimental observation of the causes of natural phenomena. However, that's not the most original meaning of science. It's rather a more specific and narrow form of thinking about the natural world. That is a notion of natural philosophy that grew up in the 17th century and explicitly called upon a notion that there was a repeatable experimental method by which it could be applied to many different phenomena to test whether from their anomalies we can observe and discover new hypothetical meaning for what happened. So if we ask what is the method of science, or what is method in general, we have to ask what is the logic that underlies that method. That is, what are the sequence of operations of reasoning that underlie how it is we discover things and come to know about the world. And in asking this question about how we come to know things, we're asking specifically about how we reason about our observations and our experience. In the history of logic, this is sometimes distinguished between deduction and induction. Deduction being a way of reasoning from universals to particulars, whereas induction is a way of reasoning from particular observations of the world to universal theories that would give it meaning. So whereas science in the ancient world is primarily deductive, that is, reasoning from universals to particular instances, science today, following natural science, is usually inductive, that is, following from the observations and hypotheses that we make through the experimentation and observation of the natural world. So if we ask what is logic today, what is the logic that underlies science, we often think that logic is mathematical logic, and a form of logic that can be minutely calculated, whether it be through the computational tables of vast textbooks or through computers themselves. In fact, our computer operating systems today use a form of Boolean algebra that can be calculated not only by machines, but also that can simulate all forms of mathematical logic. So we might think that all logic has in a way been sort of exported to the operations of machines, whether it be the sort of mechanical tabulations of textbooks or the computer operating systems that automate them today. And in that sense, the danger of this approach is that it suggests that all thinking and the truth of thought has been entirely captured by mechanical systems, such that it is no longer within the ingenuity of the human person, or even within the capacity of our own minds to discover that which is true for ourselves. And I think this is perhaps the greatest danger of mathematical logic, that it suggests that we are not in control of our own thoughts and do not have within ourselves the possibility of discovering that which is true. This, by the way, is a famous excerpt from Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica. Bertrand Russell, as you may know, was one of the great philosophers and logicians of the early 20th century. He wrote with Alfred North Whitehead this book, and on page 394, he deduces that 1 + 1 = 2, and says that this may on some occasions be very useful. So, what is theology? Theology, in the classical formulation by the Church Fathers and by medieval scholastics, was described as a science of knowing God and things divine. That is, a way of discovering through human reason, with the sources of revelation, what we can know as it's been defined by the Church as a community of believers that have, through the traditions of understanding revelation, practicing what has been taught by it, have come to know what God wants for us and how we can come to know and love God. So this is an image from the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament in the Apostolic Palace by the city by Raphael. And it depicts the disputation of the Blessed Sacrament and the meaning of the Eucharist with pretty famous theologians. So in roughly we can say that theology, according to its classical definition, ought to be scientific. That is, it ought to use not the inductive methods of natural science. Obviously, it does not have a natural subject matter. That is, it doesn't simply just investigate the world or its causes. Rather, it investigates the first principle from which the world came to be, from which the world was created, as well as its final purpose. So it has as its subject matter the basic element of any possible reasoning, that is, the study of being qua being. But it has as its absolute object God, which is both the creator and the final purpose of the world and our human destiny. So, what can we say theologically about logic? It's often been thought that logic is a pure formal science, like mathematics, that has no relevance to either human concern, about our lives, or ultimately for our mythic and graced understanding of it in relation to revealed Christian doctrines. But I think on the contrary, we can say that if logic is a way of writing about what we reason about, and also speaking about, arguing about that, and using those reasons in our daily life, that it has resonances that are plastic and can be the subject of symbolic manipulation and the interpretation of the various levels of meaning that are resonant and valuable for theology. So we can ask not only, as it were, how forms of logic ought to be used according to the way they are posited and prescribed, that is, in the way that they are calculated by forms of reasoning or by computers even, we could also ask what it means for us. That is, why do we use it, and where does it come from, and what is its purpose? So in contrast to a purely secular approach to logic that would treat the subject matter of logic as though it were entirely separate from and indifferent to any concern for its origin and purpose, the theological interpretation of logic argues to the contrary, that if there is no pure nature that's separate from the God as its creator, and no pure natural reason is not always informed by grace and by revelation, then the forms of reason they reflect and they are given from God as their source, such that all the operations of logic can be interpreted as and for the purposes of theology. For this purpose, I'm going to contrast two approaches to logic. One is a purely secular form of logic that treats logic as though it's a purely symbolic and formal system that has no relation to or ground or purpose in God, and the other as a sacred or theological way of thinking about logic that treats it as always the product of a more original gift and for which it has a higher purpose that exceeds our immanent and mechanical understanding. So with all that said, what can we say that theology ought to be? In the history of philosophy, there's an attempt to order the sciences, that is, say which of the sciences is most important, which of it governs the other sciences. So for instance, you might say that mathematics or arithmetic is more important than trigonometry, or that the study of the animals in zoology is more important than entomology, the study of the insects. The way that this question was answered by Plato and Aristotle was to say that there is a most general science that asks the most important or absolute questions, that provides the first premises and the subject matter for all of the other sciences. So where, for instance, physics studies the forces of nature, and mathematics studies the quantities that can be calculated in various demonstrations, the study of being qua being, or metaphysics, that is, the study of what there is fundamentally, provides us with a way of thinking about what would be necessary for there to be anything at all, as well as what kind of ingredients are assumed as the elementary basis for all of the other sciences. So rather than, as it were, for the physicists, exploring simply the causes of things in nature, they ask, why is there anything rather than nothing? Why is there any being at all that can be the force and the cause of anything else? So if metaphysics is the most general way of approaching any subject, and metaphysics has as its object both the principle from which it begins and its final purpose in God, that is, God as its absolute object, then theology could be said to be the queen of the science of the most general science of metaphysics, that is philosophy. So that the way that the reason it's called queen is because typically liberal arts were represented as divine women, or Holy Sophia. That is, that there was a sort of a household of feminine personifications of the roots of learning, for which theology, because it is honored above and also is able to censor and intervene in the interrogations of the other sciences, as it were held up as queen above the chambermaids of the philosophical sciences. So we'll get back to this later, but I just want to flag this, that typically today theology is thought to be a kind of very suspicious way of reasoning, a kind of arcane, almost sort of magical way of thinking about underlying physical causes that ought to be calculated and demonstrated more precisely by observational methods. But if all of those methods are open-ended, if the way that we think about the world is always infused with and derived from and directed for purposes that exceed any finite mode of understanding, then we cannot foreclose the possibility, or cannot deny to theology the traditional privilege of having this august purpose that elevates and directs our thought and everything of our lives. All right, so logic can be contrasted with theology by contrasting the finite modes of mechanical reasoning by which we can calculate the forms of argument to know the world with the sources of revelation, that is, the sources by which we come to know how God has communicated God's purposes through Scripture. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologia, distinguishes what he calls sacred doctrine or sacrament doctrina from natural reason. By natural reason, he means the way of reasoning that is informed by what any human person could know through the natural aptitudes and powers of their mind. And most of all, he thinks that this is captured explicitly by what he calls the philosopher Aristotle, mostly by Aristotle's Organa, or his works on logic. Now, he believes that there is a higher source of meaning that is not fully captured or demonstrable, not scientifically provable by natural reason, which is derived from Christian revelation. That is, the astounding event of God's command of the gospel story, ultimately the Easter week that we're going to celebrate next week, are things that could never be foreknown or in any way predicted or calculated by any form of natural reasoning. So in the Theology, in the first question, he distinguishes that continuum. He says, it is sacred doctrine and it is science because it proceeds from principles established by the light of the higher science, namely the science of God and the blessed. And he says that just as the musician accepts on authority principles taught him by mathematicians, so sacred science is established from principles revealed by God. It's not a science that can be known directly by finite mechanical calculation and natural reason, but rather one that appeals over all forms of finite reasoning to a higher revelatory source that has been shown to us by the person of Christ through Scripture and taught by the Church. However, since Thomas Aquinas, we've found a gradual unraveling of ways of thinking about logic. From the time of Plato and Aristotle through the early Church Fathers to the high medieval synthesis of Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas, there's a growing sense that was infused by the Augustinian Boethian tradition that all of logic ought to be derived from and serve this higher purpose, ought to be a way of coming to understand the ways in which we understood the doctrines of the Church that are shown to us through Revelation and constituted by the traditions and teachings of the Catholic magisterium. However, in the late 13th and early 14th century, a fissure developed which grew in part from the misappropriation and the sort of antagonistic direction of the reception of ancient logic, mostly the logic of Aristotle, by some of the medieval scholastics. Foremost among them were both Franciscans or wayward Franciscans and also the teachers of the arts faculties. This coincided, by the way, with a division within the university between theology, which was seen as the highest study that you could achieve after you pass through the study of philosophy, to a gradual separation of the study of philosophy independent of theology, for which William of Ockham and John Burgan were two of the great physicians of the era. Later, after the Protestant Reformation, in the 17th and 18th centuries, Gottfried Leibniz and Immanuel Kant devised both mathematical approaches to logic using modern algebra, as well as a transcendental way of reflecting upon the conditions of knowing that were entirely separate from the revelatory ground of Christian doctrine on one hand, or any sense that there was both a creative source and a final purpose to the way that we were reasoning. And we can roughly call this a secular logic, and by that I mean that it is a form of logic in which the symbolic formula of logic are operated within a sphere of representations that is a simulacrum that is entirely separate from its creative source and its final purpose. So it holds the forms of reasoning within the world apart from God and treats them as though they're as it were, the mechanical techniques of knowing the world in an entirely secular way that has no referent beyond itself to God as its creative source. With all that said, I want to say a few things about the kinds of logic that come down to us in antiquity, and this will help us to find a way out from the impasse created by secular reason today. So, from ancient times, and indeed already in the time of Plato and Aristotle, there were three forms of logic that had developed, of which we today believe often that mathematical logic is the foremost and pure form of logic. So Plato gave to us a vision of philosophy called dialectic. From Aristotle, we have a vision that has been called the syllogism. And later in the 19th century, we have from Gottlob Frege a view of logic that has been called the mathematical logic or quantitative technical calculus. For Plato, dialectic was, as he describes, the divine method, the way that was given to us, like Prometheus from the gods, a way of dividing the forms according to their kind. And he believed that it were possible in the examination of every form, every way of thinking or every way of speaking about the world, to divide it from both what it is and what it is not in relation to itself and another. So if we start, for instance, with animal, we can see between tame and wild, foot and wing, swimming and so forth, two-footed, four-footed, and so on. And by combining those various attributes, we can then construct a more composite form of what we want to speak of. We can do this, for instance, in mathematics. You can start with quantity, you can divide subtraction and addition, you can divide multiplication and division, and you can ultimately sort of combine both the elements and the functions to calculate anything you wish within mathematics. Now, interestingly, for Plato, he believed that this process was not something that we ourselves were doing alone, but was already operative within the world. The entire universe was already sort of divided according to the kinds of things within the world. And those things could be discovered by us, and the way that we discovered them was by imitating the way that they always already were divided, always already were mixed in various combinations. And this process of recapitulating and rethinking the divisions of the kinds of things in the world and ultimately coming to know their combinatorial mixtures was a way of thinking to and from the source from which everything came and for which everything would come to be. So it's a way of thinking to and from the eternal ideas, that is, the forms that underlie the various divisions of the kinds of things in the world, and ultimately thinking back to the source, principles of those forms, which he identified with the good itself, that is, the goodness of the highest God. Aristotle extended this method of division in his Organon, that is, his 5 works on logic. And what he accomplished using the method of division from Plato was to divide the forms of speech in truth-making statements, or statements that could be considered to be true. So if you think about it, if we say something, if I say, for instance, hooray, that's not a truthful statement, it's an emotive statement. But if I say, for instance, this chair is red, that's a statement that could be true or could be false, because the chair could or could not be red. So Aristotle distinguished these truth-making or apophatic statements, and he identified that there must be certain elements that are necessary for a statement to be true, and this is what required both a predicate and a subject as well as a copula. That is, it required not only a subject that we're speaking of, but also a way of speaking of it, and also a relation between the way of speaking of it and the subject that of which we speak. Now, he further argued in the prior analytics that from this it's possible to string together multiple premises to make a single argument. And by this, he meant that, for instance, if we start with a premise, for instance, like all men are mortals and all Greeks are men, then it's possible then to derive the conclusion that all Greeks are mortals. And this follows as a consequence of the 2 previous premises in combination. And I've illustrated this with Venn diagrams here, which is not very important, but you can see here that if from the way in which we combine the first statement and the second statement, we can produce the third statement as a direct consequence of the forms of those combinations. And the important point about Aristotle's logic that distinguished it from what Plato before and will have lasting consequences is that it was considered purely formal. That is, it did not depend for its truth upon the content of what was said. You can interchange, for instance, Greeks with Persians, and it would still be true, because the form of reasoning, the way in which you combine the subject and predicate terms, remains the same throughout and results in the same consequence. This necessary consequence is called entailment. It's, as it were, the product that follows as a necessary result of the way in which we reason. The revolutionary step that was made from this was that we no longer have to worry about, as it were, the vagary of meaning within our statements, nor about, as it were, the authority or credibility of who's saying it, or the various ways in which it's said. But we can examine the form of the argument itself and discover from that form alone whether the form is valid or invalid. That is, whether the consequence follows as a necessary result or not. So, with all that said, I'm going to pass now to the latest and most express and difficult form of logic, which is modern mathematical logic. So after Leibniz, and then following Gottlob Frege, and in the 20th century, a new form of logic was developed, which is entirely algebraic. So if you remember, in Aristotle, the relation between the subject and predicate term is an ambiguous copula, that is, for instance, are or is, and so on. And similarly, all and some is not, the ways in which we would quantify a statement by saying that it's all or some are not interchangeable between the subjects. The new revolutionary development that occurred in the 19th century and in the present day is to treat all of the elements of logic as though they are interchangeable algebraic functions. So to render a sentence as a function, and then to treat all of its parts as though they're numerically interchangeable as simple quantities. And I've represented here the most basic conditional argument, which is the modus ponens argument, from which we say, for instance, that if P, then Q, therefore Q. So, for instance, if Ryan is in the room and Ryan is speaking, and we know Ryan is in the room and Ryan is speaking. And this can also be extended to varieties of ways of adding quantifiers to those formulas, which are represented here. And then from this, any number of arguments can be developed, infinite varieties, as well as with a huge number of different ways of expressing and producing the results. So this has become the most advanced and expressive form of logic in the modern world. And there's no interesting consequences that follow from it. One is that the conditional phrase here is true even if the antecedent is false. This is sometimes called the principle of exclusion. And it also allows for a trivial inference, where, as we're the consequence can be true even if the antecedent is false. Another is that the forms of reasoning are not able to demonstrate their fundamental assumptions, that is, the fundamental assumptions both of the quantified forms, the rules, as well as the way in which they're deployed. All of this is sort of totally artificial. It's as though we have a computer program and we can input anything into it we like, and it'll produce anything we want. So this capriciousness is one of the dangers, but also one of the benefits of modern mathematical logic. On the one hand, and I've illustrated it here, we can prove the existence of God using local logic, as per Gödel, famous Austrian mathematician, did. Here it says that necessarily God exists. On the other hand, you can also prove that God doesn't exist, and you can prove anything under the sun using mathematical logic. However, the great benefit of it, and we shouldn't deny this, is that it provides us with a purely algebraic way of validating forms of reasoning, and doing so in a way that captures it according to minute specific quantities. With all that said, I think we should recognize part of the liability and danger of logic today. So, speaking here at the London Oratory, I remind you part of Peter Newman's The Grammar of Assent, he writes, "But logic does not really prove. It enables us to join issues with others. It suggests ideas, opens views, it maps out for us lines of thought. It verifies negativity. It determines when differences in opinions are hopeless, and when how far conclusions are probable. But for genuine proof on matters, we require an organum more delicate, versatile, and elastic in verbal argumentation. That's we require a way of subtly reasoning about our ideas and intuitions, even the feelings that give rise to them and direct them, that can't be captured by this mechanical form of calculation." So what are we to do with logic today? I want to argue that these forms of reasoning are not entirely separate from one another. That is, that we don't have to surrender our thoughts to a purely mechanical form of calculation that can be exported to computers, and for which our feelings and our desires, our sort of loving intuitions about the world, our neighbors, and our God mean nothing to us. I would argue that instead, that the forms of reasoning are interrelated, that they derive from one another, and that they have a higher purpose. So if we look back at these forms of reasoning, dialectic must first divide the elements that can subsequently be combined into the statements, the premises, and the arguments of the syllogism. The syllogism, also interestingly enough, can provide a mathematical basis for the way of reasoning through the algebraic quantification and calculation of its elements. Here I've represented this form of syllogism using first-order logic, but you can also form a quantified syllogism that is effectively a mathematical form of reasoning. With this being said, it's possible to analyze the forms of mathematical reasoning to a specific kind of syllogism, we can call a mathematical syllogism. It's also possible to analyze all of the syllogisms to their original division of their elements in dialectic. And from that, it's possible to analyze not only mathematical logic to the syllogism of Aristotle, but also ultimately the syllogism to the original division of the elements of reasoning in dialectic that proceeds in and from the first principles from which the forms of the world were created. That is, it's possible to analyze the elements of mathematical logic to syllogism, to dialectic, and ultimately to the circuit of ideas from which the world was created and from which everything can be thought. This provides a theological way of thinking about logic that doesn't dispense with the advances of mathematical logic, doesn't regard them as superfluous, but rather integrates them within the concentric circuits of theological reasoning. That is, the way we think about the world is equally the way that we think about God, and the way that we think is important or essential to how we come to know God. So to sort of say, in a very simplified and formulaic sense, we can say that if the forms of reasoning, the intelligible logoi by which we speak about and simulate the way that we give arguments, are grounded and communicated to us by the divine logos by the which the world was created and everything by which we think can be thought again, then all of the ways in which we have always and will ever think are always communicated as they are processing to and from us as created by the logos, in and from the Son, of the Father, and God as Trinity. That is, we can say that all of our thoughts are not superfluous to God. God thinks our thoughts and our thinking them, and our way of thinking about them is also a way of coming to know God, coming to know the Son as the Son knows the Father. So, with that being said, we can now start to examine how it is we use logic to discover the beliefs of Christian faith and theology. So, following what we said previously, we can say that logic is an art of reasoning to know that which is true. We can say that theology, the science, that is the gift of God as a gift of revelation, that is, it's a science that is derived and derives its truth from that which is shown to us through revelation as is communicated by Christ in Scripture. Now, if the subject of theology is the fundamental element of being, well, being in metaphysics, but its absolute object is God beyond being, then the subject matter of theology requires some kind of demonstration. And if further, this object stands in question, that is, God, well, we must offer some kind of demonstration that God exists. One of the questions that theologians often ask is, how can you be certain about the truth of your science if you can't be certain about the existence of God, that is, the object of your study? And for this purpose, theologians are often called upon to give what have previously and traditionally been called proofs of the existence of God. And you might find this a bit surprising because we often talk about God, especially in a very pietistic and Protestant culture, as though it's merely a matter of faith and conviction. And while that's certainly indispensable and by no means to be denigrated, the tools of classical logic and of philosophy that come down to us from the earliest Christian era have provided us a way of reasoning coherently about why it is we believe God to exist, not only as an emotive affirmation that God ought to exist, but also a way of coming to a greater certainty for which our hope gives us some initial reasons to believe. So these proofs of God's existence have, of course, there are very many, can be classified in one division and three kinds. So the fundamental division is between what is called a priori and a posteriori arguments for God's existence. An a priori argument is one that does not appeal to any of the observations of the sensory world. So it is prior to all sensory experience. An a posteriori argument, contrary, is one that draws its evidence from the world that is posterior to our sensation of it, so derived from the sensory world. Now, the ontological argument is the first of these arguments because it is the only a priori argument for God's existence. The cosmological argument and the teleological argument are a posteriori arguments because they derive their evidence from the world of motion and its purposes. So, ontological argument, these are all very complex Greek words, I'll break them down. It's an argument from being, or ontos, or the study of being, qua being. The cosmological argument is one from the world of the cosmos, specifically of the beginning of motion within the world. And the teleological argument is an argument from the purpose, or telos, of things within the world. Now, these three arguments of God's existence have in the past been treated separately, and various philosophers have favored one at the expense of the other. I'll summarize them very briefly for you. The ontological argument has its precedence in Plato and is given its classical formulation by Anselm of Canterbury, who in the Proslogion had argued that it is possible to demonstrate the existence of God from the simple idea that God is that of which nothing greater can be thought. If God must be defined as that which is greater than all that can be thought, then God could not be in any way less than that which must be greater than everything. If it is less great for God not to exist, and God is greater than that of which anything can be thought, then God must exist of necessity according to God's definition of God. There could never be a thought of God that does not exist because it would always be greater for God to exist than not to exist. The cosmological argument comes from both Plato's laws and from Aristotle's physics, and is repeated by Arabic scholastics and by Thomas Aquinas, and is favored by Thomas Aquinas. It holds that for all of the, if we observe that in every motion that a effect has a cause, and if the cause of every effect must also have a cause, but if there cannot be an infinite regress of causes, there must be a first cause that is the cause of every effect. Now, if the first cause of every effect is not itself caused by any prior cause, but is rather the cause of itself, or the is it's moved only by itself, not by anything other than itself, then it must be called the creator, the first cause from which everything else is caused to come to be. And this creator could, moreover, not be something within the sensible world of motion, because everything in the sensible world of motion must be caused to come to be from something other than itself. So it must transcend the sensible world of motion and be the creator of the entire world of motion for which everything else is caused. So we would call that creator God. The teleological argument, which is represented here by the watch, famously by William Paley's watch argument, for which he held that if we discover a watch on a desert island, we must assume that it had a creator. So similarly, when we observe the complexity of nature, we must assume that anything with great complexity in apparent design must have a creator. So we must assume that the world, in its complexity, in its design, has a designer or creator. The teleological argument holds that for every effect, there must be a purpose. There must be something for which it came to be. So in our own bodies, all of our operations of our body, whether it be nutrition or digestion, they have a purpose, namely the sustenance for our body. And similarly with entire ecosystems of animals and arguably the entire universe. So if we observe that every effect has a purpose, and there must be a purpose for every effect, but there cannot be an infinite regress of purposes, there must be a final purpose for which all other purposes serve. And if that purpose also cannot have any further purpose beyond itself, then it must transcend the world of purposes and ultimately the final purpose for which everything else had come to be from the beginning. Now, I want to argue that the cosmological argument and the teleological argument are, in fact, the same argument in reverse. That is, the cosmological argument analyzes effects to causes, to a principal first cause that transcends the effects of the world in motion, whereas the teleological argument in reverse analyzes the effects to their purposes, to the purposes that transcend, the final purpose that transcends all the effects and all their purposes, and ultimately to the final purpose for which all other effects are set in motion. So what's happening in each of these arguments is that we have an analysis from the effects to the conditions and ultimately to the principal unconditional cause of all of the other effects, whether it be the first cause, that is the unmoved mover that sets the world in motion, is the creator of the world, or the final purpose, that is the highest purpose, designer, or good of the world. In each case, we have analysis that denies an infinite regress to a first principle. And that first principle, moreover, can only be known a priori, that is, from an idea of what that principle would be, even if that principle is assumed to be necessary as the end of the argument that analyzes from the effects to either the first or the final cause. That is to say, that both the cosmological argument and the teleological argument are an analysis from effects to conditions, to an unconditioned first principle that must be known in advance, that is a priori, before any observation of the world. If that's the case, then both the teleological argument and the cosmological argument are ways of thinking about the ontological argument, that is, the idea of God that is thought, that is known according to the idea itself, according to God's definition, that is greater than anything that can be thought before any observation or analysis of the physical world. In this sense, then, all of the arguments against God, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, are virtual aspects of ways of reasoning through analysis of the idea of God before the world. That is, they're virtually contained within the ontological argument itself. So we can say that if the cosmological argument is equivalent in its form of analysis to the teleological argument, then ultimately both of those forms of reasoning can be analyzed in from the ontological argument. This has often been held to be suspect by philosophers and theologians in the past because they believe that the ontological argument is circular and for that reason trivial. The reason why they believe it to be circular is because it is thought that the simple definition of God somehow virtually contains its consequence. That is to say that it's a form of reasoning that suspiciously produces its consequence from its mere positing or from its mere assumption. And the reason why this is held to be invalid is because typically an argument that assumes its conclusion would not in fact produce an off conclusion, but would simply assume it in advance. However, in the case of the ontological argument, the idea of God is not simply a premise, like any other premise. It's not simply to say, for instance, that this chair is red or lion is in the room. Rather, it's an idea of God that is both absolutely simple and absolutely complex. That is absolutely simple in as far as it transcends the world of composite complexity and the various manifestations and movements of the world. But it's also absolutely complex in as far as the idea of God is also the cause and purpose of all things in the world, equally omnipresent, equally knowing all things altogether at once. So it is productive within itself through the various modes of arguing other ways in which we can come to know it. If that's the case, if all ways of reasoning about God, all ways of analyzing causes to conditions to the unconditioned principles, are a way of thinking in and from the idea of God, then the way in which we think, and the content of which we think, is always virtually contained, always part of a way of coming to know God as God has created and has known us from eternity. So in a certain sense, we can say that logic has a place within theology. Logic has a place within the way in which we come to know God as God knows us. And if we can sketch a systematic vision of theology, whereby we begin with God, the divine persons or hypothesis, and proceed through the uncreated circuit to the created world, then logic occupies an intermediate place. On the one hand, it's what traditional theologians have called the divine ideas, that is, the ideas of the divine intellect before the creation of the world. That is, the ideas of logic as pure forms of thought could have been known by a perfect reason or perfect mind before the creation of all matter. equally could have been known by the angels before the creation of the stars and planets, but at the same time also be discovered by us after their creation by simply thinking about the forms that are manifest in the ways we think about the world and come to know it. So the logic of the logos, the intelligible logoi that are simulated in the ways that we think about the world, come to know its truth, are themselves grounded in, directed for, and guided to the purposes of the divine logos by which God has communicated God's self to us from the creation of the world and all of our thoughts. With this, I want to offer you an interesting apologetic technique that follows from our way of thinking about the ontological argument. So you may have come across YouTube debates about the existence of God, you may have argued about it with your friends. Oftentimes they turn on examinations either of the cosmological argument or the teleological argument, that is, either of the first cause from which things came to be or of the final purpose. They either have questions about why it would be necessary for there to be a creator or why it would be necessary for there to be a designer. I believe there is both a better argument for God's existence as well as a better argument against the denial of God's existence. And this argument against the denial of God's existence we can call contra omnis atheismus, or against all atheisms. And essentially, it argues that the best argument that God does not exist is not simply to show that the cosmological or teleological arguments are invalid or in any way suspect, but rather to develop what you can call a negative ontological argument. That is, not simply that it may or may not be the case that God doesn't exist, that there's some kind of probability calculus by which we can entertain that God may not exist, or we may not wish God to exist, but rather that according to the very idea of God, God could not exist, that it would be logically inconceivable for God to exist. That is, in order to make this argument, you must, as it were, say that the only possible way to think about God is in such a way that that very idea is somehow logically invalid or incoherent, such that it defies the possibility of contemplation, something like a square circle. The interesting thing about this argument, however, is that in order to make this argument, you must presuppose that you have a higher canon of logical forms of reasoning that provides you a way of thinking truthfully about God. That is, you have to assume that you have a secular logic that is indifferent to and not self-dependent for its truth upon God or upon any higher principle of truth. In a certain sense, you have to say you have to have an ungrounded or source of truth by which you can argue for and against and arbitrate the claims whether something is true or not. Where, however, does that truth come from? The theologian, the theist, can always make the argument that truth is a divine attribute. It's part of the way that God has communicated God's self to us. It's grounded in both the goodness and the reason of God. In classical theology, they would say that it's auto aletheia, that is, it's truth itself, that is God shown to us through revelation and through all the ways we discover God in our lives. However, the atheist doesn't have a ultimate ground of truth. Friedrich Nietzsche, for instance, in Gay Science, when he says that God is dead, he says that we've wiped away truth from the stars. We can no longer find truth in the world. We have to make it up for ourselves. If that's the case, then the theist can always say that the ground of truth you're presupposing when you make these arguments, when you say that this logic is the way that we discover the invalidity or incoherence of our idea of God, is simply borrowed from the canon of classical theology. It's simply assuming a kind of surreptitious deity that provides the basis for legitimating the truth of our claims of logical reasoning that is not otherwise provided by logic. And if you look at very carefully at the literature of logic, you'll find this is a great question for philosophers of logic today. That is, it's a great question of what provides the ultimate truth of logic. How do we discover it? How do we know it? How do we communicate it? I want to argue that Christian revelation provides a way of legitimating that truth, as well as a way of confirming in practice and of regimenting how it should be discovered through various institutions that provide us with a vocabulary for speaking reasonably and truthfully about our faith. Further, you can argue that if one presents an alternative theory of truth that is in some way better than the theory of truth or the theory of logic that the Christian theologians provided, then you have a conflict between two visions of truth, two visions of its ultimate ground, two visions of its principles. In this sense, we have two visions of God. We have two visions of what would make reasoning truthful. In that case, what we're really doing is not simply contrasting atheism with theism, but we're contrasting two versions of theism, one opposed to the other, two ideas of God. This, again, is just theology. This is a way of thinking about what God must be in order for God to be reasonable and true. Now, that's the case, and the atheists are equally theologians. Spinoza was once, for instance, called the most God-intoxicated man. And if Spinoza can be critiqued by philosophers, then we can equally be theologians in practicing philosophy. So with all this said, I think that we can come back to something of the medieval notion that was celebrated by Christian theologians from Clement of Alexandria up into Bonaventure, that theology is king of the sciences, Regina Scientiarum. The reason for this is that if all specific sciences, whether they be mathematics or physics or anything else under the sun, must presuppose as its first principles elements that are provided to it by philosophy, the most general way of thinking about what there can be in the world. And philosophy finds its truth ultimately in its object, that is its principle and source, its purpose. A truth, moreover, that must be confirmed through the way in which it has communicated itself to be known in revelation. And ultimately, all the ways that we think truthfully about the world in any science is derived and finds its ground of legitimacy in theology. For this purpose, I think we can say that theology is one of the sciences, revelatory source of the ideas of philosophy, and that for which philosophy is true. And in conclusion, I'll leave you this. This is an image of the Consolations of Philosophy from Boethius, who was a 6th century Roman aristocrat who was imprisoned by the Gothic king, and in prison he wrote a book about how he was visited by Lady Philosophy, who guided him through the discovery of a way of reasoning about the world to a way of thinking reasonably about God. Thank you.